Okay. Yeah, I just tried to record this, but it didn't record at all. Okay, so Apush Unit 5, Civil War and Reconstruction. This is my PowerPoint. In the 1840s and 1850s, many Americans were debating about rights and citizenship laws regarding inhabitants of the United States and especially immigrants. There were a lot of European immigrants, mostly Irish and German, and there were also a lot of immigrants from China. Here we have a graph showing the percentage of immigrants growing in the United States. As you can see, there's a huge uptick between 1830 and 1850, especially in Irish and German immigrants. Nativism was a belief, I guess I would call it, and it was people wanted to protect native inhabitants against immigrants. I find this very ironic considering how the Americans treated Native Americans, the actual native-born Americans. They were anti-Catholic and they wanted to limit immigrants' power, especially their political power. The Know Nothing Party was a political party that kind of took this belief into politics. As you can see, they shared a lot of the same beliefs and they were mostly Protestant. Here, I thought this was funny. When I was researching pictures, a lot of people compare the Know Nothing Party to our current political situation, which I thought was pretty funny. Okay, the effects of the Mexican-American War on slavery. So arguments and tension over whether to allow slavery in newly acquired states arose. And this actually, it was a huge cause of the Civil War, whether or not to allow slavery in these new states. The Compromise of 1850 was a collection of 5 bills that attempted to settle disputes between slave and free states over land acquired from Mexico. They failed, and what I mean by they failed to decrease tension. The Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850. It stated that slaves must be returned to their masters even in free states. It was a terrible thing. There was no court case or anything, and the U.S. government was required to help catch these slaves. The personal liberty laws were laws passed by the North. They were created to counter the Fugitive Slave Act and protect slaves and free blacks in northern free states. These are some important people of the time. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote the famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which kind of shined light on the terrors of slavery and opened a lot of people's eyes to it. Stephen A. Douglas was a United States senator who pushed for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we'll talk about later. Dred Scott was a slave, and he was made famous for his court case, Dred Scott versus Stanford. He was brought into a free state by his master where he sued for his freedom. The court case resulted in a groundbreaking verdict stating that African Americans could not ever be citizens in the United States. It's crazy to think that such a verdict like that came from him suing for freedom. One man suing for freedom. Here are some pictures of them: Harriet Beecher Stowe, Stephen A. Douglas, and Dred Scott. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, was passed in 1854. It allowed the people of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be a free or slave state. The North was outraged by the act because it violated the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Here's some, on the left, you can see a political cartoon about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And on the right, you can see how it violated the Missouri Compromise. Bleeding Kansas and the Brooks-Sumner Affair. The act caused so much controversy between North and South that a series of pro versus anti-slavery battles played out in Kansas known as Bleeding Kansas. One fight even broke out in the Senate. A pro-slavery member physically attacked an anti-slavery member, beating his head in with a cane. This was known as the Brooks-Sumner Affair. Here are some pictures of Bleeding Kansas, and here's the Brooks-Sumner Affair. You can see on the left the pro-slavery Southerner beating the Northerner with his cane. The Letcomb Constitution. The Letcomb Constitution was a document written in 1857 by pro-slavery Southerners in Kansas. The Constitution advocated for the use of slavery in Kansas and had a Bill of Rights that excluded all African Americans. The Constitution only caused more arguments and anger between the sides, adding to the buildup of the Civil War. That's a theme you'll see with a lot of the things here. Just build up to the Civil War, created more arguments and tension. Speaking of tension and arguments, John Brown's raid. John Brown was a white abolitionist. He gathered 22 people and attacked a weapons facility in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia in 1859. He was attempting to initiate a slave uprising in southern states. And the raid was a precursor to the Civil War just because of the violent nature. And when I was researching this, I actually found out a lot of fun facts. Robert E. Lee was the commander in charge of taking back the facility that John Brown had captured. Stonewall Jackson, who would become a very important federal general, he was part of the group tasked with guarding John Brown after his arrest. John Wilkes Booth attended the execution of John Brown, and John Brown allegedly asked Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass to join him on his raid, but they both declined. I thought those were fun, fun facts. Here's a picture of John Brown with a very interesting beard, and on the right you can see him walking up to be hanged. The Republican Party, not the same Republican Party that we have today. The Republican Party was created in the North in 1854 by abolitionists and ex-Whigs looking to combat the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That's how controversial the act was. They were also very, very big on getting rid of slavery. The party gained popularity rapidly and became the largest rival to the dominant Democratic Party, and for a short period of time, the Know-Nothing Party. The Know-Nothing Party did not last very long. The election of 1860. The election of 1860 was the first real account of sectional parties, of course, the North and South. The dominant two parties were Republican in the North with Abraham Lincoln and the Democrats in the South with Stephen Douglas. The election was created around slavery, and a lot of their debates focused on slavery. Republicans in the North wanted abolishment, and Democrats in the South wanted to maintain their right to own slaves. On the left, you can see Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, and on the right, just some Lincoln propaganda. This map shows the divide between the United States in the election, and you can see how it really is just North and South. Split almost down the middle. Debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of 7 debates between Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln and Democratic candidate Stephen Douglas. The debates were some of the most important in U.S. history. The debates were based around slavery and states' rights. Also, the outcome of the election would the outcome of the coming election would determine the future of the United States. And on some of these debates were hours long. It's crazy to think about. The Freeport Doctrine, Douglas proposed an idea that despite the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling, slavery could be excluded from places in the United States by local government. Lincoln wins. I don't think there's an existing real picture of Lincoln smiling. I couldn't find one. Secession. After the election, Southern states began debating secession from the Union. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in 1860. The Confederation formed shortly after in 1861 when 11 Southern states had seceded from the Union. These states were South Carolina, Texas, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And this, was a huge, huge lead up to the Civil War. You can see here the states that seceded on the right, and I like this map because it shows them in the order that they seceded. And on the left, there's a funny political cartoon about all the southern states following South Carolina. Border states. Border states during the Civil War, it's a term that refers to states that didn't secede from the Union, but they did own slaves, or slavery was permitted in these states. They were Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. In West Virginia, separated from Virginia during the war, was also considered a slave state. The Civil War. Tension between the North and South had been building for years. The South secession wasn't anything to prevent conflict. Sorry, excuse me. There's a large crack in my phone, like right over the words. After the South secession, there wasn't anything to prevent conflict. The war was started to preserve the Union. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the purpose of the war. It made it almost solely focused on slavery. And lots of free and enslaved blacks fled to the North to join the Union Army and fight for their freedom. The first battle between North and South was fought at Fort Sumter. The South Carolina militia captured Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, making the first battle a victory for the Confederacy. This is about the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan was a military plan designed by Union General Winfield Scott early in the Civil War. The plan outlined a naval blockade of the Confederate coast. It was a thrust down the Mississippi and a strangulation of the South by Union land and naval forces, named the Anaconda Plan because of the anaconda snake who wraps around and suffocates its prey. And I thought this picture was funny about Nicki Minaj. Okay, Confederate antics. So the Confederate Constitution was a constitution written by the Confederate States. It protected their right to own slaves as property, and it stated that nothing could take away that right. The Confederacy used their resources to gain European support in the Civil War. They put a cotton trade embargo in place, which forced France and the United Kingdom to support them. This event is referred to as cotton diplomacy. Other stuff in the 1860s. The Pacific Railway Act aided in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, and to secure the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. The Homestead Act was an act that allowed settlers to buy as much as 160 acres of land, by living on it for 5 years and paying a fee of about $30. It encouraged rapid expansion, but turned out to be a hoax because the land was almost uninhabitable. It was unfarmable. Almost all of the people who bought the land failed. The National Banking Act was an act that established a system of national charter for the banks. The act, combined with Abraham Lincoln's issue of paper money, raised money for the federal government in the American Civil War by encouraging banks to buy bonds and tax state bonds out of existence. Other stuff in the 1860s. The Morrill Land Grant, the federal government donated public land estates for establishing a college. As a result, almost 70 new land grant institutions were established. The New York draft riots were a series of riots in response to drafting men for the Civil War. It showed that not all Northerners were in support of the Civil War, or they just weren't really willing to die for the cause, especially immigrants. Copperheads, it was a term given to Democratic Northerners who wanted to end the war with a peaceful settlement. Here's a comic depicting Copperheads on the left, and a rendition of the New York draft riots on the right. The turning point of the war. As the war raged on, Lincoln tried to reunify the country with long, persuasive speeches like his famous Gettysburg Address, in which he advocated for nationwide abolishment of slavery. The battle that took place before Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, the Battle of Gettysburg, was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It resulted in 10,000 dead and nearly 30,000 wounded. Many call the Battle of Gettysburg the turning point of the Civil War. This was because it gave the North a huge advantage, which they didn't have before that. However, it was a short-lived... So the North won, but it was a short-lived victory. The Civil War ended in 1865 with Robert E. Lee's surrender of the last Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. Lincoln died 6 days later. That's why it was a short-lived victory. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater while attending the play Our American Cousin. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the role of president. He was impeached in 1869. I feel bad for those actors. They worked really hard, and now they're only known for performing while Lincoln was being shot in the back of the head. Here on the left, you can see, I don't know if this is real, this poster, but it's a reward for John Wilkes Booth. In the middle, there's a a newspaper article about Lincoln's assassination, and on the right, there's a artist rendition of the assassination. Reconstruction. Slavery be gone. The 13th Amendment passed by Senate on April 8th, 1864, and by the House on January 31st, 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. There's a meme here, SpongeBob meme, that I thought was funny, and Django. I love this movie. I think it's great, and it deals a lot with slavery, but the 13th Amendment is not actually in it. I just liked in the top right, I don't know if you can see, it says, "Let freedom reign." Yeah, great movie. Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. Lincoln had planned for Reconstruction long before the end of the Civil War. His 10% plan stated that Southern states could be readmitted to the Union if only 10% of their voters swore an oath to the Union. Many Republicans thought that Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction were not harsh enough and that the South deserved to be punished. I sort of agree with them. 10%, that still leaves 90% that could potentially be, still violent, racist, defiant. But, he's a president, so he probably knows better than I do. President Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. In 1865, President Johnson put a Reconstruction plan into place that gave the South a free hand in regulating the transition from slavery to freedom. It also offered no role to blacks in politics in the South. This plan turned many Northerners against Johnson and his politics. It also played a role in his impeachment. Here are some comics about Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. The Black Codes. The Black Codes were a group of laws designed to oppress free blacks. They restricted their freedoms and compelled them to work for lower wages and worse conditions. The Black Codes were eventually removed during Reconstruction, but this does not mean that the oppression ended. On the right here, you can see some of the effects of the Black Codes. It was basically just a way to continue oppression of African Americans. The 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to all black Americans. The 15th Amendment prohibits the government from denying any citizen the right to vote based on their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was ratified on February 3rd, 1870. It was the third and final Reconstruction Amendment. What is ironic about the 15th Amendment is, it was so groundbreaking, but women could still not vote. Here, women's rights. It's important to note that the women's rights movement was inspired by the implication of the 14th and 15th Amendments, but they were also angry and unsatisfied with them because, they weren't included. Military Reconstruction. In 1867, the Military Reconstruction Acts were passed. They divided the South into 5 territories that you can see in the map below. Well, actually, that's only 4 territories. I don't know. Maybe this is the wrong map, but I'm pretty sure it's not. They divided the South into 5 territories. Sorry about that. That were looked over by the Union generals. To rejoin the Union, each Southern state was required to hold new elections and pass the 13th and 14th Amendments. Southern resilience. Despite their loss in the Civil War and being in control of the North, the South still held out in their beliefs and way of life. Many Southerners were trying to restore their power. So many typos. Maybe it's because I'm doing it on my phone, or I don't know, but I feel like I could not have done that myself. Power in the government in order to take back their old way of life. There was some short-term success, but obviously it did not last. Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in 1865 to aid newly freed slaves and poor whites in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau was dedicated to helping freed men. That's why it was called the Freedmen's Bureau. On the right here, you can see a Southern political cartoon about the Freedmen's Bureau. It shows a black man resting, looking lazy, and a white man doing all the work for him. They're basically saying that, white people should not be helping black people. And I think this it demonstrates that the South, was still extremely racist at the time. Steps towards equality. About 2,000 blacks occupied public office during the Reconstruction period. This represented a fundamental shift in power. Free blacks wanted their children to be educated. This thirst for learning caused many blacks to attend schools, mostly in the North. This led to the creation of black colleges and schools. The election of 1868. The election of 1868 was the first election of the Reconstruction era. The Republican nominee, Ulysses S. Grant, defeated the Democratic nominee, Horatio Seymour. Grant won. Ulysses S. Grant. Fun facts. Before being elected president, Ulysses S. Grant led the Union Army to win the Civil War. He grew up in Ohio. This I thought was weird. The S in his name didn't stand for anything. He was a notorious drinker and alcoholic. Grant was supposed to be at Forest Theater with Lincoln, but he couldn't attend. And he blamed himself for Lincoln's death. He thought, if he was there, he could have done something, helped out. Grant briefly owned a slave, but he ended up freeing him. And after his second term of president, he went on a world tour, which I thought was really cool. Here's some just funny memes about Ulysses S. Grant. Liberal Republicans. And if you think about it in modern terms, it does sound like an oxymoron. The Liberal Republican Party was a political party organized in the 1870s to combat the re-election of Ulysses S. Grant. They failed. They lost in a blowout and disappeared after the election of 1872, so they did not last long. The Panic of 1873. I thought that picture in the top right is funny. I don't know if you can see it. I'm looking from a far out, a zoomed out view. It's kind of hard to read. The Panic of 1873 was a large-scale economic depression. It began in Europe and eventually reached the United States in 1873. The event most responsible for the depression was the failure of the J. Cook Company and over-speculation on railroads and land in the West. People's credit dried up, foreclosures were common, and many banks, railroads, and businesses were shut down. And the depression lasted for 4 years, but the effects, they were much more devastating and obviously lasted more than 4 years. The Credit Mobiler scandal was a scandal that started when a group of rich Union Railroad builders and owners formed the Credit Mobiler Construction Company, then hired themselves to build their railroads at highly inflated prices. This is genius. I think it's genius. They bribed several congressmen and even Vice President Schuyler Colfax. That's definitely not the correct pronunciation, to keep their scandal from going public, but it was eventually made public in 1872. Here are some political cartoons about the Credit Mobiler scandal. Southern slurs. This slide is just a collection of Southern pejoratives. Despite their loss in the Civil War, the South retained almost all its racist, backwards, and sectionalist beliefs. Carpetbagger was a pejorative term used by Southerners to describe any person from the North who moved to the South after the Civil War. The South viewed these people as exploiting the Southerners and taking advantage of them. Scallywags was a phrase used to describe white Southerners who supported Reconstruction after the Civil War, and it was also an offensive term. Here are some pictures about carpetbaggers. You can see, they all look like they're being used in offensive ways. Here are some scallywag pictures. I don't think this picture on the right was intended to be about history, but I just thought it was funny. The South stayed strong, and it was for worse, in my opinion. Even after Reconstruction, Southern plantation owners possessed the majority of the United States land. Lots of black Americans tried to buy land of their own, but the majority failed. And the sharecropping system kept Southern land out of the hands of poor whites and blacks. Sharecropping, it's an agricultural system in which the owner of a large amount of land lets a tenant rent the land in return for a share of the crops said tenant produces. The majority of the tenants were black, and A lot of them didn't succeed. But on the right, you can see these pictures. The conditions, they don't look great, but it was definitely, even if it was a small step, it was definitely a step up from slavery. Because at least they were free. Racism. I included this frowny face. I don't want it to seem... Oh, shoot. Okay. I include this frowny face. I don't want it to seem like I'm taking this not seriously or I'm being lighthearted about it, because I'm not. Okay, the Redeemers were a conservative pro-business faction in the South, in the Southern Democratic Party, sorry. Their goal was to regain Southern political power and enforce white supremacy. The KKK, Ku Klux Klan, it was a dumb name, still is a dumb name, will always be a dumb name. It was a white supremacy group that was established in 1865 and was a part of almost every Southern state by 1870. They are notorious for inflicting violence on blacks, and they strongly opposed Republican Reconstruction and policies. The KKK still exists today, and it's terrible. On the left, you can see a modern picture of a KKK rally, and on the right, you can see a burning cross at a KKK gathering. That was like their symbol. Disgusting. Combating the KKK. The KKK Act, commonly called the Enforcement Act, was an act passed by Congress which gave the president the power to suspend the right of habeas corpus to combat white supremacy organizations, mainly the KKK. One step forward. Actually, let me go back to this slide. I just want to say I heard a politician talking about this, and he was using it to say that sometimes, or no, he was using it to, he was defending President Trump abusing his power, and he said all great presidents have abused power, just like the suspension of habeas corpus in the 1800s. And I just couldn't stand him saying that because, yes, you could say it was an abuse of power, but it was an abuse of power to fight the KKK and white supremacy groups, not to help, ensure your own re-election. I just wanted to say I thought that was so dumb, such a dumb thing to say. Okay, one step forward, two steps backward. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked. Even though the country had just fought a civil war on behalf of freedom and equality, large amounts of segregation, white supremacy, violence, hate groups, Supreme Court decisions, and political injustices eventually took away the rights of black Americans. They wouldn't regain these rights until the 1960s, and there are still race inequalities today. I said traces of inequality today, but there is a large amount of inequality today. The Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 was an unwritten deal that settled the intensity during the 1876 presidential election. It caused the federal government to pull the last troops out of the South. This compromise formally ended the Reconstruction era, and here are some comics about it on the right. The Slaughterhouse Case. The slaughterhouse cases were legal disputes over the monopolizing of slaughterhouses in the South. They resulted in a Supreme Court decision in 1873 that limited the production of, the crack on my screen is right on that word, of immunities, and freedoms. Privileges, immunities, and freedoms. Sorry, I didn't know the context. That the 14th Amendment had granted. United States versus Cruikshank. United States versus Cruikshank was a court case that resulted in the allowance of violence and deprivation of the rights against newly freed slaves, their citizenship rights, equal protections of law, and several other amendment provisions were being deprived. It was a huge step in the wrong direction. Huge step. U.S. versus Reese. The United States versus Reese was a voting rights case where the Supreme Court narrowly construed the 15th Amendment. It was started over a conflict involving the denial of a black man from voting due to unpaid taxes, which he had tried to pay, but his tax collector refused to accept for racist reasons. And what really gets to me about this is that it was $1.50 unpaid taxes. $1.50. It was obviously more back then, but still not a lot of money. The Civil Rights Case of 1873. The Civil Rights Case of 1873 ruled the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited racial discrimination, was unconstitutional. This led to other racial injustices that would not be constitutionally resolved until the 1960s, but the prejudice and racism still exist today. And that is the end of my PowerPoint, and I really hope to God it recorded.